Hello, everyone joining today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from across the globe. My name is Anherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP. That's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, and I am absolutely delighted to be serving as your co-host today and being the first to welcome everyone to this fifth session in the series of ICVA's and PHAP's learning stream on humanitarian coordination, with the overall purpose of providing NGOs and individual humanitarian workers from all over the world with a stronger understanding of the various humanitarian coordination mechanisms. So today's event is going to be focusing on the new way of working where humanitarian, development, and where appropriate peace actors work together towards collective outcomes. I do want to point out there's been a tremendous interest in today's session, which is very exciting, and I'm pleased to say that out of the more than 80 online events that we've produced over the last few years, this one has had the most registrations, with 870 plus people joining from more than 100 countries. Many of them are participating live right now in this platform. Many more are joining through the live stream on YouTube, and many more will be watching the video shortly afterwards in time zones for which this is not the most convenient time. So thanks so much for all of you, to all of you who have joined us live today. It's going to be a really exciting conversation. So this great virtual gathering is made possible by ICVA and through the Geneva Humanitarian Connector, an initiative of PHAP supported by the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, which is designed to build dynamic connections between humanitarian actors in Geneva and, importantly, between Geneva and the rest of the world. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce my co-host, Melissa Patati, Head of Policy at ICVA. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Anherad, and thank you to all who are participating. It's so nice to be back with you all. If you remember one of our last webinars that I participated in on the Grand Bargain, we did a little poll, and we asked the participants how many of them knew about the new way of working, and 98% had said they would like to learn more. So it's really great that we can bring this topic to you today, and it's really important for NGOs to improve their understanding of where the new way of working is going, as it's got a lot of support from very important people and could really impact on NGOs operating in humanitarian action. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank ICVA's donors who provide core support to ICVA. This includes Danita, Germany, IKEA, Swedish CETA, Switzerland, but also ICVA's members. So thank you for helping us make these learning sessions a reality. And the final thing I'll say at this point, hot off the press, we have a new briefing paper called The New Way of Working Examined, which will be a nice little supplement for all of you who are learning about this topic today. We'd like to achieve 4 things today. First, we want to have a better knowledge of the new way of working, including what it's trying to achieve, what actors are involved, what are its potential implications across the humanitarian sector. Secondly, we want better awareness of what the new way of working's potential impact could be on NGO operations and policy priorities. Third, we'd like more familiarity with the opportunities NGOs have to engage and to contribute and to influence the new way of working going forward. And fourth, we'd really like to have more familiarity with further sources of information so you can learn more about the new way of working after this webinar.
Thank you, Melissa. And now to introduce our first 2 speakers. Bruno Lemarquis has been serving for UNDP for over 20 years, mostly working in crisis, post-crisis, and transition settings. He's currently acting director of UNDP's Crisis Response Unit, and he'll be going with a bit of back and forth with Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer, who joined OCHA in 1998 and since 2007 has been chief of OCHA's Policy Development and Studies branch. So Bruno and Hans-Jörg will be jointly presenting the new way of working and will explain what this process is really about, what are the main practical steps and challenges in working under this new collective approach, and why the process has been triggered now.
Their presentations will be followed by Lise Fuqua. She's going to be speaking on the operational risks and opportunities that this new approach may have for humanitarian operations. She works as a senior humanitarian advocacy advisor for Action Against Hunger, which is an NGO that works both in humanitarian and development. She works with other humanitarian actors in Geneva on issues related to principled and effective humanitarian action like this. And last but not least, we'll hear from James Curtis. He's currently the country director in Ethiopia and Djibouti for the Danish Refugee Council. He's going to present the challenges, considerations, and opportunities this new process is presenting for NGOs in the field, and he's going to use the lens of a country experience that he's had in Djibouti.
Okay, so now we will hand the floor over to Bruno to start things off. Over to you, Bruno.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. So the word, it's very good to see such an interest for the topic. So no pressure. I'll say a few words about as a starter. I'll say a few words about where does the new way of working come from, and why the current momentum around this new approach. So as you all know, at the World Humanitarian Summit last year in Istanbul, the UN, through the Secretary General and 8 heads of UN entities, UNICEF, HCR, WHO, OCHA, WFP, FAO, UNFP, and UNDP, with the endorsement of the World Bank and IOM, signed and launched a commitment to action in which they agreed to support a new way of working in crisis settings. And this new way of working is aimed at moving from delivering aid and meeting humanitarian needs to reducing and ending needs, to reducing vulnerabilities, and to managing crisis risks better. So this is the core sentence for the new way of working. So this commitment marked an important breakthrough to the long-standing issue and long-standing debate on the humanitarian divide, on what has been called the gap between relief and development. So over the years there were different terms being used, and we've all lived through that, through our career, respective career, wherever we've served, I think. And this approach so far has largely hampered progress for millions to reach and to find solutions, to help vulnerable people to find solutions, people who are caught up in protracted crisis. So to me, the discussion and the problem statement in themselves are not that new. It's a well-known problem, and there have been previously previous attempts to find a solution to this divide, and we've all struggled with it in our different communities, or I call them ecosystems, whether we sit on the development side or the humanitarian side or other constituencies. So this is another attempt, but this time a very serious attempt to bridge this divide. The difference this time, I believe, is the very, very strong momentum around the need to find a solution and to work differently. And there are, so I call that the alignment of the stars. There are a number of factors, of events, of policy discussion that have brought us closer, and so I believe the stars are aligned. Among those factors, I would just go through a few of them. The first one was the adoption of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are much more ambitious than their predecessors, the MDGs, and with their explicit ambition to reach those left furthest behind. And those left furthest behind are mostly living in protracted crisis or are displaced population. So in order to reach those people and to lift them out of the situation, it's important that we work differently to bring solutions, not only systems but solutions. A second factor was as we all know, the growing number of protracted crises that last longer and longer, year after year, requiring more and more financial resources in particular through humanitarian appeals, not leading to solutions. So that's a realization that we need to work differently in those settings. Another factor might have been the pressure put on demand for ODA on donor countries because of the refugee crisis. So there has been pressure with higher demand on ODA. Another factor is, if you go 2-3 years back, the very intense process of consultation prior to the World Humanitarian Summit, and I'm sure many of you have been involved. All those consultations throughout the world, through the regional processes. A lot came from those countries. A lot of voices from crisis-affected countries, crisis-affected people, for a different way of operating, with more investment and more focus on preventing crisis from happening in the first place, building, working with national systems, national capacity, national actors, less siloed approach, more risk-informed development to tackle, to better manage risk. A lot of that came through those consultations. Me, I call that a crying call for a different way of working. And then finally, the last star is we have a new Secretary General in the United Nations who have very clear priorities articulated around prevention. We need to prevent, we need to prepare, but we need to prevent crises from happening in the first place. And a call for much greater coherence across actors, humanitarian development, peace actors, to work differently and more coherently. We've also heard a lot since this initiative was launched from the field. Yeah. There is a lot of demand from our field colleagues to work differently. And my final word is, to me, this agenda is largely about common sense. It's common sense to work more coherently across ecosystem. And when you speak to many colleagues in the field, for them it's really, really common. Over to you, Hans-Jörg. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to build upon what Bruno said at the beginning, the new way of working comes out of the World Humanitarian Summit, and those of you who are familiar with this, there was core responsibility, which is about working differently to end need, reduce vulnerability, and risk. And this comes out of a number of research over years, many interviews with non-governmental organizations, local partners, but also some of our own resident coordinators at the UN who said, if you want to make progress in reducing risk and vulnerability and needs, particularly in protracted crisis, you need to apply a different lens than an annual work or budget plan. And I have to say, in particular, from many of the non-governmental organizations, they said we're very often for months in the implementation cycle, but then we're for 4 months in the fundraising cycle. So multi-annularity already is an important element of this way of working differently. So that was the beginning of the consultation. So that's why many donors, many of the partners, many organizations said, I mean, if this World Humanitarian Summit should make progress on one issue, it is for sure on this issue of the humanitarian development nexus, to bring those two spheres a little closer. And the reason why this particular chapter in the World Humanitarian Summit was called Transcending Humanitarian Development Divides is that many of us learned during the food and fuel crisis in 2008, 2009, that payment of budget support provided by the IMF can be as life-saving because it allows countries to continue to pay subsidies to smallholder farmers, as can be direct food aid. So it's more about what needs to be done in the short, the longer, the medium term perhaps, than it is about necessary the spheres in the first place. This is the thinking that went into the summit, and out came this commitment to action, to a new way of working. There could have been many other titles. We picked the new way of working because what is really new in it is, I think, particularly one of those three core elements. The three core elements of this new way of working, as we always say, is working over multiple years to reduce need, vulnerability, and risk, multiple years, to a collective outcome, and I'll say something more about that in a second, and with a diverse range of actors. So it's not only a new way of working for the United Nations agencies or for the international aid community. It also recognizes that in many places, local civil society, local authorities, national government, private sector contribute, and actually in some places better placed than international providers to contribute to solutions, or need over several years to be built up and capacitated to take over some of those tasks. So the three core elements that we always stipulate on this is multi-year comparative advantage of a diverse range of actors, and all of them working to a collective outcome. Again, just to mention or dispel sort of a misunderstanding, the new way of working is not to replace either humanitarian or developmental action. It's not instead of humanitarian action. It's not instead of the humanitarian principles. It's not to replace humanitarian with development work, and it is not to shift funding or budgets from one side to the other. It is to make sure that in protracted crisis settings, in this area of vulnerability where humanitarians and development communities normally work together, and if we tie it to the SDGs, in particular in the range of the first 6 SDGs, reducing zero hunger, health outcomes, and so on, in that bracket, I would say that's where the new way of working can really lead to a different way of these two communities working together to a collective outcomes over multiple years. So it's not every year a collective outcome. It's an outcome that you design and articulate in consultation among all partners in a given situation that are relevant and are willing to make predictable contributions that you work towards for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So that adds a multi-annularity into this. It gives a clear signal to donors that you need to build up and commit to a number of years, but it also leads to a very clear and tangible, measurable, quantifiable result. Now, what could be an outcome, such a collective outcome? What could it be? One example that we always used is for example, on IDPs. If you have in an area 1 million IDPs, no one expects over 4 years or 5 years for them to go down to 0. But you should, based on planning and analysis, identify what groups of IDPs, longer term, protracted, possibly, could be turned into a different status, could be integrated in local communities or settled somewhere else or returned to their places of origin. And what does it take? And you can see in the case of integration, for example, in a new host community, there are all sorts of infrastructural work and labor issues, but there are also still more short-term health and food security and shelter solutions that need to be found. But they need to speak to each other, and that's one of those examples. Another one, just to mention, is in the area of health. One of the under the SDG 3 on health, one of the targets speaks to child mortality, and it says by 2030 to reduce child mortality, I think, by 30 or 40%. Now, if you operate in an area where child mortality under 5 is a major issue, the idea would be right now to say what for a specific group of the population or a specific area of the country, what contribution can you make in a quantifiable manner to reduce the level of child mortality over the next 3, 4, 5 years? What does it take by donors to invest? What does it take to invest in health infrastructure facilities? But also, what does it take, initially at least, to build up or to continue some of the humanitarian work and progress? So it's in protracted crisis in this area of vulnerability, particularly around those first 6 vulnerability-focused SDGs, to have a different way of working over multiple years, diversity of actors to this common and collective result. Now, we've started, as Bruno said, to take this to the field, and I have to say the reactions in the field were super positive, and I think that's why it is so important to let the field, not just to hand very quick and detailed guidance down from headquarters levels now, whether that's the United Nations or any of the other participants on the line, but to really allow the field also to work with us, obviously, on concepts, but also to let them come up with solutions. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's only one way of arriving at a collective outcome in the end. And so what we're seeing right now is that in countries like Mauritania, Chad, Sudan, Somalia, and a number of others, Burkina Faso, and so on, that people are experimenting with finding the right footprint between the UNDAFs and the HRPs. There's a lot of work that's already gone into joining up analysis. People found, for example, that in the developmental planning process for the UNDAFs, the Common Country Assessment, the CCA, that the humanitarian needs overviews are very, very critical because they go to a deeper level of household and community information. So a lot of meshing and merging of information has happened there. We see that this leads in some places then to joint up planning processes between UNCTs, UN country teams, and humanitarian country teams. Obviously a difficult issue. We have other situations where people only have a United Nations country team, and NGOs are not necessarily part of that country team, but they then created sort of a partnership framework so that humanitarian and other NGOs can join the same effort and that be presented to donors. That's what I mean. There are different opportunities, but also barriers that we encounter and will only encounter if we now take this to the field and let the field also drive some of these things. So this will have an impact, I think, both on some of the tools and mechanisms and ways of working that we have gotten used to over the last 10, 15 years since the reform in the humanitarian field. It will also, for sure, have an impact on how the developmental planning and mechanisms and tools are being used in these areas of vulnerability that I described before. One last point before closing is Bruno mentioned the donors, and we may have some online. I think the donors have a very, very critical role to play in all of this. I want to include the World Bank and other financial institutions in this as well. We will only succeed in really making this nexus between humanitarian and development stronger, or in actually implementing collective outcomes, if the money flows do not continue to just go into fragmented initiatives and activities and so on, but if the investments are made into a collective outcome. So that means the resident coordinators, humanitarian coordinators, the government, and all of us, we need to present our contributions in light of how they contribute predictably to achieving this collective outcome. So and donors ultimately need to respond to these presentations, then seeing that their contribution actually funding a certain program is actually a predictable contribution to that collective outcome. So we can talk probably more in the questions and answers, but just to reiterate, this is not just a United Nations reform. This is something that absolutely at the field level needs and already does include many NGOs, and it will only succeed if the financial institutions and the donor community also walk down that way to put investments and funding behind collective outcomes rather than individual agency activities. Thank you. Back to Bruno, I think.
So maybe I'll add a few additional elements on the next step and practical initiatives that are ongoing. So to move this complex agenda forward, there are principal actions are required at many different levels, keeping in mind that what counts at the end is the operationalization of this agenda in the field. Yeah? So that the action are required for our field colleagues to come up with maybe a different set of incentives for collaboration in the field. Actions are required with our respective institutions, whether we are UN or NGOs or member state or donors. We are all working within the confine of bureaucracies, and action also required to keep this momentum at the political level. Important to know that the new way of working, I don't think it is a standalone, short-lived policy initiative, but it's a rather comprehensive undertaking that is really about changing mindset, and it has many moving parts that involve a multiplicity of actors and processes. So no surprise that you will hear references to the new way of working in many of the policy discussion across the various, what I call the ecosystem. To support the countries, as Antioch said, this agenda is making headways in a number of countries, and so far, something I also wanted to say, so far the idea was not to pilot the new way, to designate countries as new way of working pilots, because this could have been the best way to kill this initiative. So for the first few years, it has really been bottom-up initiative in countries where, again, the stars are aligned at country level. You have the conducive environment, you have the right set of actors, you have very good leadership, and this agenda is making headways. So to support those countries, there are a number of elements that are moving or that are being put in place. One is the support to those field initiatives. So there are a number of things going on. There are peer exchange. We are trying to walk the talk through workshops at the regional level. So in February there was the first workshop in Dakar for some of the countries in West Africa. We are now working with partners to organize a regional workshop in other regions, and of course NGOs will be invited and most welcome to share their experiences also. There is remote support to share experiences gained from other countries. There has been a number of support missions, so this is all short-term support mission to help our colleagues to unpack this agenda. And then deployable capacity. So in UN speak, it's deployable capacity essentially in the office of the UN leader, the resident humanitarian coordinator, to have additional capacity of people who can work across humanitarian development. So this is all the practical type of support that so far has been provided. More is needed, but these are the first steps. Another important element in terms of moving forward the agenda is to collect evidence. It's critical to collect evidence coming and lessons learned, best practices coming from those countries. And we believe there are about 15 that have really made that are really trying and are making headway. So what are they learning from the way they have tried to do more joined-up analysis? They have worked on their planning, aligning to collective outcome. They have tried to revisit the coordination arrangement, all those elements. So collecting evidence, we are about to embark, and there will be a lot of consultation around this exercise. We are about to embark on a proper, almost a research project with a proper methodology to extract those lessons from the field. From this important process, we will extract best practices, but also blockages. We will be able to put our hands on the blockages. I personally believe that if the field leaders and our field colleagues have the bracket, I put a big bracket, have the freedom, the license to operate, the freedom to operate, they can make a lot of headways with this agenda. Maybe 80% can be fully driven in the field. And then we need to put our hands on the remaining maybe 20%, maybe more, maybe less. That will require changes within the bureaucracies, within the institution in terms of policies. So it could be policy, it could be accountability structures, it could be the incentive system, it could be the architecture of our institution, it can be the funding architecture and so on. That could require changes at headquarters level. So that will be a very important piece of work. Another piece of work is this new way of working, which is a broad agenda, needs to be picked up and inform policy discussion in the different ecosystem. So on the humanitarian side, it's through the Interagency Standing Committee. It needs to be discussed. It is being discussed. Many of you are part of those discussions on the IAC side. On the development side for the UN, it is called the UN Development Group. It's also being discussed. What does it mean from the development perspective? What do we need to change? How do we need to adjust? And so on. It needs to be picked up, and it is being picked up in the grand bargain process. The lessons learned from the field and new way of working are informing some of the grand bargain work streams. It is being picked up in discussion in OECD, INCAF. It is being discussed and picked up in many policy forums. So that's very important because it's where policymakers can already start adjusting the instrument. Another element is people. I call myself a UN dinosaur. I've been working for 20 years in the same agency. Many people, we work in the same ecosystem for a long time. How many of us feel confident to work across ecosystem? It's not the majority. It's a tiny minority. We need more people who feel at ease working and knowing enough about the humanitarian dynamic, the humanitarian mindset, the humanitarian instrument, the same on the development side, and a few also on the peace building side. So we have more people who can walk the talk without any fear, with being comfortable because they understand the logic of the three ecosystems. So we are also launching an initiative to look how we can groom. So far it's starting as a UN initiative. I hope we can expand it. How we can groom more colleagues, train more colleagues, identify more colleagues when they are joining the organization, so that they are developed as either bilingual or trilingual colleagues, humanitarian development. And finally, the last important, very important element in terms of next step is the high-level advocacy. We need to maintain the political momentum. and this is within our respective organization, but very importantly with member states and with donor countries. So there has been already in 2017 3 high-level events in Copenhagen, in the margin of the World Bank Spring Meeting, and in Istanbul, bringing together senior-level policymakers from donor countries, affected countries, UN, NGOs, and this way very rich discussion, also bringing the evidence from the field. So this continue. And last thing, within the UN, to keep this momentum, UN is the Secretary General is establishing a steering committee on development humanitarian cooperation. It's about to start. It will be chaired by the Deputy Secretary General or from the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the UNDP administrator, bringing major operational agencies and the World Bank around the table to discuss this issue, keep the momentum, and move the agenda forward. So these are all steps that are happening as we speak. It's a big. There are many moving pieces. Very important to keep the dots connected. But it's for the greater good.
Thank you very much. Thanks both to Bruno Lemarquis and Hans-Jörg Strohmeyer for their presentations to get us started today. I'm going to give the floor over to my co-host Melissa to ask a couple of follow-up questions before we move on. Over to you.
Thank you, Angerad. We have one question for Bruno and one question for Hans-Jörg, but I'll just take a step back. The 3 essential concepts, what is new about the new way of working, are these issues of collective outcomes, working on comparative advantage, and working according to multi-year time frame. So it's important we get these 3 pieces right to understand what's happening. So the first question will go to Hans-Jörg about collective outcome. You've said that specificity is really important to get it right in these different contexts. And we received a question from Jonathan in Albania. Jonathan asks, do you see any tension between achieving collective outcomes and finding contextualized responses? Do you think those work hand in hand, or do you think there are sometimes going to be challenges to having a consistent approach of coming up with collective outcomes that's context specific? That's the Hans-Jörg, but then we'll turn to Bruno on this issue of comparative advantage. One of the key areas that we're looking at now with the new way of working, as you had said, is the Secretary General looking internally within the UN. We received a lot of questions with regard to how UN agencies, some who have mandates or other areas of work that could sometimes overlap. Do you foresee any issues or plans to address some of the issues of silos in between the agencies or structural barriers? We received a question from this from Sho in Japan, from Emma, from Yvette in Australia. Yvette even asks, do you think we'll be seeing any changes in the number of UN agencies that are involved in these areas? So we'll start with Hans-Jörg on the issue of collective outcomes and then turn over to Bruno on comparative advantage. Over to you, Hans-Jörg.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to Jonathan for the excellent question. I think and that's why what I said before, that's why it's important to let the field drive this. What we will see is that you have even complex emergencies where you have large parts of the country maybe on a protracted, more developmental trajectory, but you do have pockets of high vulnerability or even new displacement and so on, and we all have a number of countries in mind probably on this. So I think it'll be important that we actually don't just come up with very standardized ways of arriving at a collective outcome, but that we also accept that you could, in part of the country, have a very traditional, basically humanitarian approach still, emergency needs and new displaced and making sure that they receive the shelter and the food and the water and the attention, the protection that they need, while in different parts of the country, and Colombia would be potentially one of those cases, you actually have for vast parts of the country a protracted situation where you need to make sure that humanitarian and development work differently together. So you could have a collective outcome for that group, but a very specific, for example, humanitarian outcome or humanitarian plan for for a different group. I think area-based approaches, I mean, much discussed, I'm sure, in one of your other webinars, will be very important in these contexts. So I don't think that context and collective outcome is necessarily exclusive, unless Jonathan has a very specific context in mind. On the contrary, I think it is actually part of what makes the collective outcome relevant, that it recognizes that there are different communities, different spheres, bringing in their different qualities and comparative advantages into different areas of the country. You could also, for example, look at in some countries the difference between urban and rural responses, which we have both, and craft outcomes around it. So it's really what I'm trying to say. It's in the way you articulate, or in the way, let me step back, in the way you do your analysis, and that's why the analysis part is so important, that we bring this longer term analysis, the longer term also economic trends and population trends and so on, with that very often very granular household level, community level information that humanitarians and many of the non-governmental organizations, even more so than the United Nations, produce. So the sound analysis of the needs and vulnerabilities in specific parts of the country, and you may have countries where the entire country is engulfed in a specific need, but that analysis is important actually to then trigger the articulation of the right outcome. So you could have a range, not 15, but 3 or 4 or 5 outcomes, collective outcomes in a country around priority interventions that actually is a mix of looking at a particular population, let's say IDPs in a particular part of the country, whereas another collective outcome would actually look at, let's say, food security or food insecurity for almost the entirety of the country, or in a different part of the country. So again, collective outcome is the articulation or the response to vulnerability and needs and risk analysis throughout the country, and that obviously needs to lead to a much more contextualized and area-based approach. I hope that answers a little bit what Jonathan had in mind.
Thank you, Hans-Jörg. Now let's turn over to Bruno. Bruno, do you have anything to say on the issue of comparative advantage and looking at the lens within how UN agencies work with each other? Over to you, Bruno.
So to reflect on that, well, first to say that the major operational UN agencies are signatory to the commitment to action, so that's absolutely critical, and also most of them will be part of what I mentioned at the end of my last intervention, of this high-level, principal-level steering committee chaired by the Deputy Secretary General, to keep the momentum across the system, to send the right signal to the field, to provide the right set of incentives, to move the agenda forward. So I think it's largely a whole-in effort on the UN side. Most of the agencies are dual mandated, so for many of them it's a natural conversation. It's happening quite naturally. There is also a very big process, many big processes in the UN as we speak in terms of reform, and one of them is the UN development system reform, where this agenda is also taken on board, including a call through this reform for agencies to work more coherently to deliver on the SDGs. So I think this is it's a conducive environment for the UN to come along this agenda. At the field level, as you've heard from Hans-Jörg, there is a lot of progress in a number of countries, with agencies working very well together when the stars are aligned in those countries. And as Hans-Jörg just said, having a joined-up analysis, also looking at drivers of vulnerability is very important for all actors to reach from the same sheet of music and then coalesce around those collective outcomes. But there is a caveat, and that's why this agenda has a lot of moving pieces. The UN agencies are largely receiving voluntary funding from donors, and a lot of this funding is still earmarked or is still single-year funding. So this is also why to change to move the agenda forward, changes is required on multiple sides. including on the funding architecture.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next presentation. Very pleased to welcome Lise Foucault, Senior Humanitarian Advocacy Advisor with ACF, who will be speaking with us about the new way of working and potential opportunities and risks for NGOs. So Lise, over to you. You have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So big thanks to ICVA and PHAP, first of all, to organize this discussion, and thanks also to Bruno and Hans-Jörg for taking the time to share their perspective with us. So as mentioned, on my side, I'm working for an international NGO, Action Against Hunger, that works both in humanitarian and development fields with a strong background in humanitarian work, especially in conflict situations. So first, I would like to echo what has been said earlier. Navigating the humanitarian development nexus is certainly not a new debate, but the context has certainly evolved recently, as this is clear in Geneva, with increased financial constraints and the multiplication of protracted crises. So at this point, where the new way of working is already reaching the field in several countries, we're not here to make an analysis of something that is currently being developed, but rather to contribute to this development by asking some of the questions that seem important for all of us to answer. The humanitarian development nexus, through the new way of working, but also in the CRRF, presents both risks and opportunities for NGOs. So my first question is about how do we avoid seeing the humanitarian agenda pushed out by more political issues. In most of our countries of operations, as soon as we start talking about development, the discussions and plans become tainted with political agendas, and it often translates into no more funds and attention to humanitarian life-saving needs. So this new way of working clearly places long-term support at the forefront, and in that context, we see a high risk that the humanitarian agenda will therefore be downgraded to a secondary place in many contexts. Yet, saving lives should never become secondary. There can be no development nor stabilization while people are starving or children dying from malnutrition. On the other hand, in terms of programs, with the commitment to multi-year timeframes and the conflict prevention agenda, we must be ready to address vulnerabilities and support people based on needs, not on stages of being a refugee, an IDP, or a host. It is an opportunity to make both fields more principled and respectful of the do no harm by supporting people, everyone in need. Moreover, it is time we actually listen to people who are affected by this crisis, and everywhere on the planet they ask for means to sustain themselves, live in dignity, and feed their families themselves. It is often a matter of protection to provide livelihood solutions during an emergency. But creating livelihood options, as you know, does not only depend on aid, but is also a very political matter, with restrictions, especially for the displaced, on the right to work, access to land, and sustainable housing. So we hear states in Geneva recommending against camps, but are we massively giving people the right to locally integrate or resettle in a place that accepts them? My next question is about how we avoid slowing humanitarian responses down, and what is the plan to make development actors and donors quicker and more flexible? When we hear about coordination of an increased number of actors, or about planning long-term as soon as we start responding to a crisis, there is something there that we tend to forget, is that emergency response can be unsophisticated at times because it has to be quick. And what makes it urgent is the humanitarian imperative. So with the current focus on being sustainable from the onset of a crisis, there is a risk for increased bureaucracy and slowing down the response. That being said, and here's my question to my colleagues from the UN here, what can we do, on the other hand, to use the new way of working as an opportunity to push for quicker, more flexible humanitarian and development responses, especially in terms of funding? Because despite progress by some donors, we were promised in many countries to get recovery and development funds to take over from humanitarian funds. But the money is mostly not there, and it's not being disbursed transparently. Development donors need to step in earlier and differently from what they do now, not in a sequencing manner after humanitarian activities are over, because these fields are fluid and cannot be simplified to either one or the other. So the current appeal system seems ineffective in responding to needs in a timely and comprehensive manner. Better mechanisms are necessary, including early contributions from member states and guarantees for timely disbursement. This would also have advantages in regards to the independence and neutrality of aid. So how can we contribute to showing governments, including by using the ground bargain, that donors need to step up their game and change their ways of working in terms of funding as well? The new way of working also, I'm trying to change PowerPoints here. The new way of working also raises questions about the humanitarian space and the fundamental mission of humanitarian actors, which is to address the humanitarian imperatives in a principled manner. As we all know, adherence to humanitarian principles is our way to access civilians, all civilians, especially in conflict situations. So how concretely do we ensure the humanitarian space remains protected from military or political agendas related to state building, migration, or security in a context of collective outcomes? Many development programs do not contradict humanitarian principles, and many of us, including my own organization, implement both humanitarian and development programs. It is more the how development programs are planned for, funded, and coordinated that raises questions. These programs are often linked to political objectives of donors and national governments. Yet, humanitarian access is often a matter of perception, especially by parties to a conflict, precisely of not being integrated in anything related to national or foreign government. So let's be honest, remaining principled in an environment that is not is already a challenge today. So what will it be tomorrow when we are expected to work closer together, not only with development actors, but also with peace actors? How do we avoid a blurring of lines between actors and mandates? It seems, and it has been noted by some member states here in Geneva, that we should talk about complementarity rather than integration. But how do we foster complementarity without losing on our respective comparative advantages? This is not clear for now, and it's not enough to just mention that we will provide space for principled humanitarian action. What are we doing concretely to protect that space? Last but not least, this new way of working is built over the premise that we should work as a collective. Yet, the new way of working started by being presented as a UN process. If we want to seize this opportunity to work better together, the development of any new way of working should necessarily include affected people and communities, and civil society, especially with the localization agenda being pushed forward. Sustainability necessarily means investing in local capacity, transferring knowledge, empowering community actors, and establishing lasting partnerships. So if we are to better respond to people's needs, we have to include them in the process. Not at the end, but at all stages of the process. Affected communities and civil society, including local and traditional leaders, host communities, first responders, local authorities, local health centers, schools, universities, and professional groups, local private sector companies, and local and international NGOs that are actually working every day, doing their job and serving people in the field, should be the first to be asked about how to better serve people in need. If this is an opportunity to change and reform the aid system, let's start by asking the people who actually know it the most. For now, we have not heard about large-scale consultations, neither in country or at global level. Very few NGOs at global level have participated in a handful of meetings. So how do we ensure the collective, whole-of-society approach translates in practice at this development stage? I will stop here, but happy to leave the floor to my colleague James in Ethiopia and continue the discussions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. We'll turn now to James Curtis, Country Director for Ethiopia and Djibouti with DRC. James, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thanks very much for the introduction. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining around the world. I'm really pleased to be given the opportunity in my role as Country Director for Danish Refugee Council in Ethiopia and Djibouti to share from an NGO perspective. And we certainly here are by no means experts in engaging with the new way of working, but we are navigating our way, and I think we definitely have been able to identify some considerations and challenges and opportunities in sort of taking the new way of working from a policy initiative or a policy concept to an operational reality. And I think I want to start, let me just get the slide there. I think from a starting point here in the field, and I'm calling in from Addis Ababa, it's interesting. I think most senior management in NGOs in Ethiopia and Djibouti, and I would assume in other countries as well, are not particularly aware, very aware, or engaged in a meaningful way with the new way of working as such. And I think this is really one of the biggest problems that we have moving forward. And it's events like these and briefing documents like those produced by ICVA that can really help us to raise the level of understanding and awareness of NGOs. But this really is a key problem. It's the communication, it's the information, it's the understanding. And we really need to be better informed in order to ensure a place for ourselves in the inclusion and meaningful dialogue with other actors, because that's so important also for us to be able to start engaging and offering ourselves in analysis and assessment, joint assessments and analysis, and looking at things and framing things differently. This also means that as NGOs, we have to be more comfortable engaging with different actors we're not used to communicating with and engaging with, and that also means that we have to change the language that we're using or the understanding of the language that's being used, and I think that's going to come with time. But it's really important that we're engaging in that way. It's absolutely impossible for us to conceive of collective outcomes as such without significant NGO inclusion and participation in the process. And we really need to recognize our own value. So just to say that I think that it's really important to recognize our own value as NGOs, and sometimes we're so busy operationalizing our projects that we don't put our heads up into the level of policy from a country level, and I think this is really important. We need to recognize that we have that operational experience, which is so important in the contribution to this method of working, and understand that we are key to its implementation and the learning that needs to be fed up from the very from the field level to the country level and into best practices. I think over the last 10 months or year in Ethiopia and Djibouti, we've had the experience in engaging somewhat with a comprehensive refugee response framework, and this has really helped, I think, NGOs both in humanitarian and working more in humanitarian and development areas to think a little bit differently, to reframe the work that we're doing, and it also has helped us to understand some of the risks involved in say, not engaging, and that we could be left behind if we don't take the opportunities where there are opportunities to use our voice, to bring our experience to the table. So I think we're adapting in that way already with CRRF in Ethiopia and Djibouti for sure. And then leadership for NGOs really has to be present at country level. We have to make sure that we, again, take the opportunity in the coordination meetings and the forums and the discussions that we're having, and that we are committed to the outcomes that anchor and drive the new way of working forward. There's somewhat of a stratification, and I think what's happening at different levels is probably a lot more engaged, and there's a lot more progress being made, but we often don't really see that. As I said before, we're looking in a different direction, and that's more operational, and we need to break through that. We talk quite often about the siloed approach that we traditionally take here, have taken as NGOs and working in humanitarian or development activities. And I think, at the most field level, I think in order to achieve more of a collective outcome, we have to ensure the engagement of both our humanitarian and development technical capacity. And I think that really comes from leadership, and that's where leadership as country directors or heads of program or senior managers in the field need to help and to be coached to be able to join the mindsets and the skill sets together to ensure that we're looking at each context that we're working in from both a humanitarian and a development perspective, and to take the early opportunities to integrate or sequence humanitarian development activities appropriately, while also deepening our level of analysis and understanding of the conflicts and potential barriers to peace within which a particular operational context is developing. And so with the effective leadership, I think it's possible to build development capacity and development-oriented thinking within our humanitarian-focused technical staff, and vice versa. And again, it's really about leadership. And we need to train ourselves to see things differently. Opportunities and new ways of working will then more readily, I think, present themselves at the field level, which then hopefully can be transferred and listened to at country level, leading to adjustments in the way that we work and hopefully the identification of best practices. And just briefly, I did want to take up the case of Djibouti, and this was in thinking about this presentation. We as the Danish Refugee Council have been working in Djibouti for the last 18 months or so, and I think it presents some interesting opportunities for really operationalizing the new way of working. It's a small country with a small population, prone to humanitarian shocks as well as development challenges. There are only a few NGOs present working alongside relevant UN agencies and other key actors, and there's been a scarcity of both humanitarian and development funding available there. And we as NGOs have been forced to really maximize every dollar or euro that's coming in to best address both vulnerable communities in a humanitarian situation, but also to utilize that assistance to address longer-term development challenges. So because we've been forced to, we've worked more closely together, and so we've actually somehow sort of bridged the humanitarian development nexus in that regard because of that collaborative, sort of that more collaborative approach to things. So we could actually learn some lessons, I think, from smaller countries like Djibouti to be able to feed into or make them transferable to larger countries like Ethiopia and beyond. So finally, just to say sort of the way forward, I think for us as an NGO, and I think as somewhat of a community here in Ethiopia as well, we really have to look at sort of stronger NGO leadership at country level to engage. We have to strengthen the communication with all actors and make sure that we're a part of that process, and also have that robust field level engagement and learning, and that the silos are broken down sort of between that humanitarian and development side of things, and that we broaden our vision and the lenses that we're using to view the context that we're working in, and that we remain agile in both responses. In both response and humanitarian needs and development programming, sort of as we plan for the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Excellent presentations and very helpful to get both of your perspectives on the related issues. Before I turn it over to Melissa for the Q&A moderation, I'd just like to highlight a few of the results of the polls. It was really interesting to see all of your input coming in during these last two presentations. So first of all, we do have a majority of people on the line today with experience working in humanitarian development context. So a lot of relevant experience and a couple of specific questions we put out to you. First, there was the concern raised by Lise regarding whether or not the new way of working would help make things move quicker, more flexible, more agile. And here we saw there was a bit of a split in the response, but really with a significantly large proportion of people disagreeing, showing some serious concern in that regard, which was interesting to see. And then second, when you were asked what was the biggest challenge, or what is the biggest challenge for humanitarian actors when working with development and peace actors, by far the #1 response was politicization of aid. So thanks so much for your responses to those questions. And now I'm going to hand over to Melissa to moderate the Q&A. Over to you.
Thanks, Angharad. Thank you to Lise and James for your excellent presentations. What I'd like to do is actually, you've raised a lot of questions in your presentations that have been echoed by many of the participants in our webinar. So I'd like to put together and cluster some of the questions and first direct to Hans-Jörg. Lise raised really important issue of humanitarian principles. So I'd like to ask three things related to that. First, she mentioned this issue of ensuring that we still maintain emergency response capacity. We can respond quickly in emergencies. And this whole issue of aligning planning processes between humanitarians, development actors, and when appropriate peace actors could imply that we have to add some bureaucratic elements to the way we work. Robin in the UK had said, have you seen any examples of delays in emergency action as a result of working closer in alignment with development? I wonder if you could speak to that issue of whether or not you see this new way of working in any way hindering our emergency response capacity. That's #1. Second question comes from Lena in Myanmar. Lena is asking, how can we avoid the provision of humanitarian aid from being politicized in the new way of working, especially considering that we'll be working in contexts that may have some special dynamics at play. And the third question related to this comes from Ali in Pakistan. He's asking how explicitly the new way of working would result in governments being encouraged to work with NGOs in the development of analysis, of planning and programming, financing, etc. So I'd like to send, first of all, those three questions over to Hans-Jörg, and then I'll turn over to Bruno for the next round. So over to you, Hans-Jörg.
Thank you very much. those easy questions. No, look, I mean, on the very first, and I really listened carefully to Lisa and everyone else, and I think the most important thing is to say it's a very good thing that people test whatever we're trying to do on the new way of working by challenging us in terms of is this compromising the humanitarian principles? What does it do to humanitarian space, and so on and so forth? This is not something where you say, just please stop just harping on this. This is important. No one, and if those of you, I'm sure all of you have read this, the One Humanity Shared Responsibility Secretary General's report for the World Humanitarian Summit, but that's where the World Humanitarian, where this idea of the new way of working comes from. And if you look at that report, it actually sort of has 8 key, not principles, but key building blocks in a way. And one of them is very clearly to say, in a way, if I may say, call it the downtown Aleppo or Bangui or whatever Sarajevo test. Of course, where you have emergency situations, no one expects us to move major parts of a national development agenda, where the life-saving and the acuteness of the crisis is the most important. That is at the center, and that must always be preserved and protected. So that's why I said at the beginning that the questions around the new way of working is not that it replaces humanitarian emergency assistance. And so even within our own office, OCHA, we have these discussions. It is in a way to add a second trick to the first one. And it's to say, yes, humanitarians have to be good and continue to be good at delivering, coordinating, facilitating that immediate acute emergency assistance. But that is not always and everywhere our reality anymore. If we look at the humanitarian appeals, they are on average today no longer 1 or 2 year appeals, you know. They are 7, 8 years, and the majority of complex emergencies were therefore 20, 22 years with appeals. So we are in these scenarios on a longer term basis. We've seen a vast increase in investment in humanitarian assistance. We put these out every year with the World Humanitarian Data and Trends report that OCHA puts out, where we've seen 400, 500, 600% increases of cost for a variety of reasons, but also because I mean, research shows that the longer we provide and invest in humanitarian assistance, even in protracted crises, and that's what we're mainly talking about when we look at the new way of working. It's a disincentive to donors, to governments, to put any money, any investment into development. And these people just become our caseload, and what we do is on an annual basis provide humanitarian assistance and keep them alive and whatever, add some livelihood features where we can. So that cannot be the solution. And so that's what we're talking about. We're saying, of course, where emergency needs exist, they need to continue to be addressed. But our reality today in many, many conflicts, in many, many situations, whether that's around food security, health outcomes, displacement, or other needs, is actually a very long-term or medium-term, long-term protracted situations, and we need a situation we need to work differently. And that's where we need to see that the investments that we're making on the short-term connect with what we're trying to achieve on a short term, connect with the longer term. Let me take the example of Somalia right now. Very complex, but people understand that there's a famine situation. You need to save lives as much as you can, but at the same time, people are saying, so where do you want us to be in a year, in 2 years? Do we continue to raise these enormous amounts of billions of dollars? That's not sustainable either. So you need to find solutions over the next 2 or 3 years, and you need to articulate them and advocate for them to say the investments that we're making in saving lives right now in the short term, $4 billion plus, they will actually gradually connect with the following investments that we're making to avoid a famine in the future. And that's exactly what the resident coordinator is working on right now in Somalia, for example, with both communities on the developmental and humanitarian side. Anyway, just to say, it's not replacing humanitarian assistance. It's where we are in protracted situations to identify the opportunities for outcomes that take us beyond that short-term success of having saved a life. And I think someone mentioned earlier that we should consult people, and probably there needs to be, as always, more consultation than we all can carry out. But a few years ago, the Listening Project did carry out such a project. And I mean, there are many findings, and I'm paraphrasing it very incorrectly probably, but it boils down to many of them saying, thanks for saving our lives, but you're losing our livelihoods. So we're doing okay on that side. I'm not saying enormously, but we're doing okay on that side, but we're not doing okay on connecting what we're doing in the short term with the medium term. That's what this new way of working is about. Context, of course, matters, and again, where governments are parties to a conflict, we need to factor this into our interaction with the government. But I mean, many of us do this every single day. It's not as if we can afford to go to a place and say, you know, but we're talking to everyone, but we're not talking to the government, even if they are a party to the conflict, because they control areas, they give permits, and they provide, they continue to provide, they provide obstacles, they provide incentives. So, but not every area also is a conflict area. Again, we cannot just make conflict and acute hot conflict situations the default of how we work on the humanitarian side. We are daily working in many areas where we don't have in large parts of the country or in the entirety of the country actually an acute hot conflict. We have protracted food insecurity situations, poverty situations, whatever, with spikes of need. And that's where, again, we need to engage the government. We should actually encourage the government to make contributions to a collective outcome predictably through infrastructure, through investments, and so on. But of course, then in others where the government may be the problem or be a party to the conflict, or discriminate against certain populations, to factor this into our interactions with the government. And the last point is, and probably it answered a little bit the question, whether NGOs should be working with governments or not. I assume most of you do already. So does the United Nations. I do think that it must always be our objective to bring government to, as a colleague of mine said it a few years ago, to put governments in front of their responsibilities. And that can only happen if we bring them into the plans, into the compacts. They may not always want to do this, but that should be our objective. But allow me just one last point, without opening a whole another can of worms. But it must also be our ambition. It's not only national government, and very often in this discussion we talk about national government. We find even in situations of conflict or tensions, we find that local government very often is much more interested in getting things moving and so on. So government also happens at the local, at the communal level, and at the civil society level. That's why I think the new way of working also needs to look at how we can connect with those local civil society, local government, and other groups to get them actually to beef up their investments and contributions to the new way of working. I know that was a lengthy answer, but the context is complicated. Thank you.
Yes, context is indeed complicated. Before we move on to Bruno, who I've got a lot of questions for him, I just want to give Lise a chance to respond, because Lise, you had some thoughts on humanitarian space. Over to you, Lise.
Yes. What we mean is how, about this humanitarian space, how concretely are we going to do that? And we understand the notion of collective outcome. If not, I mean, we are not completely sure how we are going to define those collective outcomes, but we understand the concept definitely. I think the further we move towards this notion of collective outcome, the more it will be necessary to insist on the diversity of our sector, because it is not necessarily clear for everyone, including governments, including local authorities, and including other actors, even among our community, what are the differences between humanitarian and development actors, and increasing communications, maybe trainings, will be necessary on humanitarian principles and their use and why they exist to go alongside this movement towards collective outcome. Thank you. That's just what I wanted to add. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm sure we'll have a lot more conversations about that afterwards. But now I'd like to turn to Bruno. Bruno, you mentioned the creation of this steering committee of UN principles. You're very familiar with the different processes at play related to rolling out the new way of working. So I wanted to ask you some questions building on James's presentation. Now, James had talked a lot about the importance of communication and inclusive platforms for dialogue. So first, Thomas in Ethiopia was asking how the voices of affected populations are going to be considered in the new way of working. We look at affected populations. Second, we've received a question from Francesco in Kenya asking more explicitly how local and national NGOs are going to be supported to be part of the process, especially if they're not given some additional core support to invest staff time in this. Third, we got a question both from Michael in the UK and Dua in Nepal about how the new way of working links to the Grand Bargain. Grand Bargain Workstream 10 is looking at humanitarian development nexus, and so it's very relevant for the new way of working. And fourth and finally, Cohen in Switzerland is asking how the new way of working relates to the comprehensive refugee response framework, which we've heard about from James. So I put all these questions together in one place because NGOs are really trying to understand how these different global processes connect to one another and how different stakeholders can engage. So over to you, Bruno.
Thank you for these key questions. I don't think colleagues in the field will enter into a room where it will be a new way of working meeting. I think the new way of working is a way of thinking that will influence processes, existing discussion, and it's for teams on the ground, actors on the ground in the different communities, ecosystem to walk the talk and discuss how they can bring coherence between their different agendas. So there are ongoing processes on the humanitarian side, on the development side. We need to find and actors, local actors, need to engage into this discussion at local level and get their voices heard. In the UN, a lot of that is in the humanitarian country team discussion where NGOs are member of, and in the UN country team where it's more the development actors. Some of the leaders pushing this agenda forward in the field are trying really to bring those two groups together to have more collective discussion. Often the participants are the same, so to have more collective discussion, bringing the group of people discussing humanitarian issues, group of people discussing development together. I think local and national NGOs have a critical role to play to bring voices from countries, to bring voices from affected people, to influence this discourse. My understanding, especially what I referred at the very beginning, this consultation prior to WHO, there is a crying call coming from affected countries for less siloed approach, and a lot of that was coming from CSOs and local NGOs. So those voices need to be heard. The evidence needs to be brought to the more formal discussion at country level, including in the HCT. The new way of working and the link to the Grand Bargain. Well, the new way of working is a mindset shift, essentially, that needs to influence many of the processes. Grand Bargain is one of those processes. It's a very important process, mostly looking at efficiency and coherence. So this work stream 10 of the Grand Bargain, which was slightly different to all the other work streams, and maybe we need to change the name, not call it a work stream anymore. It was more a way to influence some of the other critical work streams, such as the work stream looking at assessment. How do you have more joined up assessment, immediate and longer term issue of health multi-year financing, where the evidence coming from the field in terms of new way of working should inform those discussions. So that's how it links. It's not a separate work stream doing separate work. It's how to influence all the other relevant work. The CRRF, I think, is as Hans-Jörg said, placement situation. This is an ideal case for having collective outcome. It's not only about short-term responses, humanitarian responses, care and maintenance type responses, but it's also at looking at solutions. So the CRRF is one of those frameworks that brings the two together. So to me, it's very much in the spirit of the new way of working. I've heard sometimes that there are CRRF countries and new way of working countries, and I don't understand what it means. New way of working is influencing. It's a way of thinking. It's a new way of thinking. CRRF is an initiative that is focusing on countries. So I think we need to sell the feeling or the concern that they are two different things. No, CRRF walking the talk when it comes to the new way of working.
Okay, thank you very much. We are unfortunately coming rapidly to the end of our time. We have a lot of questions that have come in. We are not able to address them all live during the events, but we will be attempting to follow up with the speakers afterwards on all of these other questions that have come in so that we can pull those together in written form as a resource that can go along with the recording, and all of you will have access to that. So thanks so much for all of those great questions, and we will follow up and pursue as many of them as we can. So now we're going to come to closing remarks from each of our speakers. I'd like to go once more around this virtual room, first to James, then to Bruno, then Hans-Jörg, and finally to Lise. So if you have just 1 minute worth of closing thoughts you'd like to leave with us, this is your chance. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much. No, just to say that, and I'm just echoing what has already been said, but this is a process. It's a new way of working, but before we work in this new way, we really have to think in a very different way, and we have to frame things in a very different way. And I think, again, we can't see this as just a sort of box-ticking exercise or something that's just a process that's sort of going to be a policy thing. We really do need to engage, and we need to be a part of making this work collectively in a very positive way. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in the discussion, and look forward to engaging.
Thanks so much, James. Great to have you with us. And now over to Bruno. You have the floor.
First, to thank ICVA for this opportunity. I think it's very good to bring so many colleagues around this community to do more of that sort of community advocacy. It's a very complex agenda, and Rome was not built in a day. And also, I'm trying to get some English quotes. Sometimes we can't see the forest for the tree, and we are in our day-to-day work. I think it's a complex agenda, many moving parts. Everybody has a role to play. It's for the greater good of affected people so that we find solutions for the furthest left behind. I think NGOs have a critical role to play, to engage, to influence the agenda, to bring voices from the field. I think it's absolutely critical. Sometimes we are not very good at connecting those dots, but I think through the IEAC, through country-level discussion, it's very important that you are associated with this portfolio process. Member states, UN, and NGOs and CS. Please engage, please engage. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time and for being with us today. I'd like to turn now to Hans-Jörg for closing remarks. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also my thanks really to ICVA. I mean, I would have loved to go on. The questions are fantastic, and I really want to encourage you to consider, given how important this issue is, possibly doing it on getting into many of the other questions. And I take James's point before. We need to do more, invest more in building that understanding, that reach out, and share even initial findings and practices. As many of you should feel encouraged to share whatever positive or not so good things you pick up in the rollout of the new way of working. Number two, I mean, if you want to find more information, I mean, coming out of the World Humanitarian Summit, this agenda for humanity that we're taking forward, there is an information platform with all the commitments that have been made. It's called the PHAP. Many of you have contributed to it, and you can find on agenda for humanity, one word, .org, I think .org or .com, I think .org. You can find a lot of information on almost everything that has happened, many of the workshops and high-level conferences that Bruno has mentioned, so you can read up some more on the new way of working, as this is one of the key outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit. Lastly, just to say, I mean, yes, context and principles absolutely matter. We need to preserve that space where it is downtown Aleppo and everything else. But it's also not only about the institutions and the agencies and so on. It is at the end of the day, and that's what we mustn't lose. And I guess that's what Bruno said in terms of not losing the forest for the trees. It is ultimately about the people we serve, and it's about reducing their needs, vulnerability, and risk. And we have a moral obligation, an actual obligation, responsibility, to not stop halfway, but to go the full way in reducing their need. And very often humanitarian assistance does not reduce their vulnerability and risk ultimately. And that leads to the donor point that we, I think, left unanswered. I think we see some donors moving, ECHO, Denmark, Turkey, and others. We see some others having more difficulties on this. But I think the donors have a very important role to play in investing over 5 years into an outcome and into the activities, whether they be humanitarian or developmental, that lead to this outcome, and have accountability around it. And accountability needs to be us, the agencies, the governments, and the resource providers. Ultimately, otherwise you will fail these outcomes. So the resource mobilization in the right direction is an absolute critical part by governments, by donors, by international financial institutions. Not the only one, but an important one.
And thank you very much. And now, last but not least, I'd like to give the floor to Lise for some very brief closing remarks. Over to you, Lise.
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree with Hans-Jörg that we could go on like this for a while, and that's actually what is necessary. Brainstorm together and be creative together. And I think it's a good thing that it seems to be an open conversation. Now, if I had to mention 2 takeaways from this discussion, I think there were a lot of questions about the protection of humanitarian space, but I think what I would really like to insist on is the necessity to effectively and expressly put affected people at the center of any new way of working, and ensuring the participation of civil society, local and international, but really like affected people must be somehow included at all stages of this new way of working and new way of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers for being with us in this excellent discussion. It will be great to have an opportunity, as mentioned by several of you, to continue it in other fora. But now we've come to the end of this 90 minutes, so we'll have just a few wrap-up points to make here. First of all, the audio and video recordings and all of the mentioned resources will be available within the next few days on the event webpage. You'll also receive an email with a link and explanation as to what is available there. Also, once translated, the video recording will be available with subtitles in French as well as in Arabic.
Thank you, Ingrid. So ICVA is going to try to continue following the conversation after today with NGOs and the new way of working. If you'd like to learn more, I do echo Hans-Jörg's recommendation to take a look at the Agenda for Humanity site on the new way of working. You could just Google it, Agenda for Humanity, new way of working. It's got some great resources. Also in the document that we've just published is ICVA. There are 2 pieces that you might be interested in. First, we created a reading list at the very end of the document of all the things we read to learn about the new way of working, so that might be interesting for you. And second, we've created a section for NGOs who want to get further involved in the new way of working, a few ideas of different fora that they could participate in. So if you'd like to learn more about how to get involved or you'd like to read up, check out that as well. We're thinking now about what would be the next topic for another learning stream. So we've got a poll here on future potential topics. Hans-Jörg just suggested we could have another webinar on the new way of working. You'll see in the poll, one of the topics could be this nexus, humanitarian development peace nexus. We could continue there. Or maybe you're interested in talking about forced displacement. So that's there, another option. Or finally, especially given ICVA's focus on regional approaches, rising actors, the third option you could choose is regional approaches to humanitarian action. So please fill out this poll. We definitely pay attention to what you say in these polls as we plan for the next phase.
Excellent. Thanks, Melissa. And I would like to echo that. Very much looking forward to see how you would all like to continue these conversations in this interactive space. Now, the last session in this series on humanitarian coordination will take place on the 9th of November. We'll be hosting a session in which we focus on how NGOs can better engage and interact with government-led coordination structures, as well as on NGOs' role in the refugee coordination model. You can read more about this upcoming session and register now by clicking on the banner on the screen.
And ICVA is going to be organizing next week on the 12th of November, 12th of October, at 10 a.m. Geneva time, 3 p.m. Bangkok time, a regional learning webinar on understanding the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. We're going to have some great speakers, Adelina Kamal, who's the Executive Director of the Center, Oliver Lacey Hall, the head of OCHA Indonesia, and Dr. Hung Ik Chung, Chair of the ADMER Partnership Group and Vice President of Mercy Malaysia. So if you'd like more information on that, please visit ICVA's website, or you can send an email to secretariat@icvanetwork.org.
And then a final point, I'll just quickly remind you about some previous sessions in this series on both global and country-level coordination mechanisms, NGO consortia, and NGO engagement with OCHA. You can now access the audio and video recordings of all of these past events by clicking on the banners, also by visiting the relevant pages on the PHAP and ICVA websites. ICVA will also be publishing briefing papers for each topic in the coming months. So with that, I'd like to thank once again all of our participants for their great involvement and excellent questions in today's event, to our 4 speakers for their valuable input, to my co-host Melissa for her hard work as the moderator of the Q&A, and of course to the teams at both ICVA and PHAP who have been working hard behind the scenes to make all of this possible. It's really been a pleasure working with all of you, and I look forward to next time. So with that, this is Anne Lang signing off from Geneva.